On the night of December 1st, 1969, a man in a suit reached into a glass jar on live television and pulled out a blue capsule. Inside was a slip of paper. On the paper was a date. September 14th. Across the country, in living rooms and barracks and college dorms, every young man born on September 14th felt something drop in his stomach. That was number 1. The first birthday drawn. They pulled out another. April 24th. Then December 30th. 366 capsules. 366 birthdays. And if yours came up in the first third, you were going. That was it. No appeal. No argument. You were going to Vietnam. Most people under 50 have never heard of the draft lottery. But if you were a young man in America between 1964 and 1973, or if you loved one, you never forgot it. Because that night, and everything that surrounded it, cut a line through an entire generation that has never fully healed. To understand what the draft did, you have to understand what the world felt like when you were young. If you were born in 1948 or 49, you grew up in a country that still believed in certain things without question. Your father had fought in the big war, the one everybody agreed on, and he came home to a parade and a GI Bill and a house with a yard. The deal was simple. Your country calls, you answer. You do your duty. You come home. That was the way it worked. That was the way it had always worked. And then you turned 18. And the country called. But this time, something was different. The war was on the television every night, not in newsreels at the movies weeks later, but right there, in your living room, between dinner and the Ed Sullivan Show. You could see the helicopters. You could see the body bags. Walter Cronkite was reading the casualty numbers in that steady voice of his, and the numbers kept getting bigger, and the reasons for the war kept getting murkier, and your parents were starting to look at each other across the table in a way they hadn't before. You were 19 years old. You had a letter from the Selective Service in the mailbox. And you had a choice to make, except it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like a trapdoor. The Selective Service System, the draft, had been part of American life on and off since the Civil War. But Vietnam was different. Vietnam was the first time in modern memory that the country was deeply, bitterly divided over whether the war was worth fighting, and the draft forced every family in America to have a stake in that argument. Here's what the numbers looked like. Between 1964 and 1973, roughly 27 million American men were eligible for the draft. About 2.2 million were drafted. Another 1.5 million volunteered, some out of patriotism, some because they figured if they enlisted they could choose their branch instead of getting assigned to the infantry. But those numbers don't tell you what it really felt like. What it felt like was this. You were sitting in a classroom or working a shift at the factory or pumping gas at the Texaco on Route 9, and you knew, every single day, that a letter could come. That your number could come up. That by this time next month, you could be in a swamp 12,000 miles away, carrying an M16, wearing boots that never dried out, with leeches on your legs and a platoon sergeant barking orders who was maybe 23 years old himself. And what made it worse, what made it something that ate at the conscience of the whole generation, was that the draft wasn't equal. If your family had money, you could go to college. College meant a deferment. A deferment meant you didn't go. If your father knew the right doctor, you could get a medical deferment. Bone spurs. A bad knee. Something on paper that kept you stateside. But if you were a working-class kid from Akron or Baton Rouge or the south side of Chicago, if your family didn't have the money for college and didn't know the right people, you went. And the racial math was even harder. In the early years of the war, black soldiers, who made up about 11% of the population, were dying at nearly twice that rate in combat. Young black men being sent to fight for a country that was still making them drink from separate water fountains back home. Dr. King talked about it. Muhammad Ali refused to go and lost his title for it. The contradiction was right there in the open, and everyone could see it, and a machine kept running anyway. So the question that faced every young man, and every family, wasn't just, do I serve? It was tangled up with questions about fairness, about class, about race, about whether the cause was just. Some went because they believed it was right. Some went because they had no choice. Some went to Canada. Some went to prison. Some stood on the steps of the Capitol and burned their draft cards in front of the cameras. Every single one of them paid a price. And here's the part that people forget. It wasn't just the men who were drafted. The draft reached into every living room and every relationship. Mothers watched the lottery broadcast with their hands over their mouths. Wives drove their husbands to the bus station and didn't know if they'd ever pick them up again. Girlfriends wrote letters that took 3 weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. Fathers who'd served in World War II sat at the kitchen table and tried to explain duty to a son who just watched a village burn on the 6 o'clock news. And there were women who didn't just wait. More than 11,000 American women served in Vietnam, most of them nurses, many barely out of nursing school when they were sent overseas. They worked 18-hour shifts in field hospitals and evacuation wards, putting together the boys that the war was tearing apart. They held the hands of 19-year-olds who were dying and wrote letters to mothers they'd never met. 8 of those women didn't come home. Their names are on the wall, too. And for decades, almost nobody talked about what they went through. The draft didn't just take men out of their lives. It tore a hole in the fabric of how families understood themselves. But if you think the hardest part was going, you'd be wrong. A lot of men will tell you the hardest part was what they found when they got there. Not the fighting, though the fighting was terrible. Not the heat, not the bugs, not the fear, though all of that was real and constant. The hardest part was the slow, creeping realization that the war they were fighting didn't look anything like the war they'd been told about. They'd been raised on John Wayne movies and their father stories of Normandy and Iwo Jima. Wars where the lines were clear, the enemy wore a uniform, and when it was over, you'd won something. Vietnam wasn't that. In Vietnam, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. A farmer in a rice paddy in the morning could be the man trying to kill you at night. You take a hill, lose friends taking it, and then be ordered to abandon it a week later. You'd hear the politicians on armed forces radio talking about progress, and you'd look around at the mud and the chaos and the body bags and think, what progress? Where? And the hardest thing of all, the thing that settled into the gut and never left, was the question that nobody in command could answer to your satisfaction. Why are we here? And then you came home. Not on a troop ship with your whole unit, the way your father did. Not pulling into a harbor with crowds on the dock. You came home on a commercial flight, a chartered 747, or maybe a military transport to Travis Air Force Base in California, and they processed you through and handed you your discharge papers, and that was it. You were done. Go home. A lot of guys will tell you they were told to change out of their uniforms before they got to the civilian terminal. Not officially, nobody put out a memo. But the word got around. Don't wear your dress greens in the airport. Don't let them know where you've been. Because back home, the country had turned. The anti-war movement, which had started as a French thing on college campuses, had grown into something enormous. The March on the Pentagon. The moratorium. Kent State, where National Guard troops shot 4 college students dead during a protest in May of 1970. The country wasn't just divided, it was tearing itself apart. And the men coming home from Vietnam walked straight into the middle of it. Some veterans were called baby killers to their faces. Some were spat on, and before anyone says that's an exaggeration, enough men have told the same story independently that it carries the weight of truth, whether it happened to every vet or not. What isn't debatable is the silence. The massive, suffocating silence. No parades. No welcome home. No one at the bar asking about your service. At best, people changed the subject. At worst, they looked at you like you were part of the problem. And then there was what was happening inside. They didn't call it PTSD yet. They called it shell shock in the First War and battle fatigue in the Second. By Vietnam, they were calling it post-Vietnam syndrome, or, more commonly, not calling it anything. You were supposed to tough it out. You were supposed to readjust. You were supposed to put it behind you and get on with it, get a job, get married, be a man. Except the nightmares didn't stop. The sound of a helicopter could put you right back in the landing zone. A car backfiring on a Tuesday afternoon in Columbus, Ohio, could send your heart rate to the roof. You'd wake up soaked in sweat, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. You'd fly into a rage over nothing, or go numb for days, or sit in the garage at 2 in the morning staring at the wall because lying in bed in the dark was worse. And there was no one to talk to. Your wife didn't understand, how could she? Your buddies from the war were scattered across the country, dealing with their own versions of the same thing. The VA was understaffed, underfunded, and overwhelmed. Guys were waiting months for an appointment, and when they finally got in, the treatment was a pill and a pat on the back. It wasn't until 1980 that the American Psychiatric Association officially recognized post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis. 1980. 15 years after the Marines landed at Da Nang. By then, hundreds of thousands of veterans had already been living with it, unnamed, untreated, unexplained. Exposed to Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant sprayed across the jungles that the government swore was harmless and that turned out to be anything but. Men were getting sick, cancers, nerve damage, children born with birth defects, and the VA spent years denying the connection. The men who served in Vietnam didn't just fight a war. They came home and fought another one, against their own government, against indifference, against a country that wanted to move on before it had ever properly looked at what it had done. In 1982, they built the wall. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial. 2 long panels of black granite set into the earth on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. No statues of generals on horseback. No eagles, no flags carved in stone. Just names. 58,281 names, etched in black stone, stretching from one end to the other. When the design was first unveiled, a lot of people hated it. They called it a black gash of shame. They said it was too simple, too somber, that it didn't honor the sacrifice the way a proper memorial should. There were arguments, petitions, public hearings. And then it opened. And the men came. They came from every state. They came alone and they came in groups. They came in old fatigue jackets and they came in suits and they came in wheelchairs. And they walked along that wall, and they found the names they were looking for, and something happened that the architects and the critics and the politicians hadn't predicted. They touched the names. Grown men, men who hadn't cried in 30 years, men who'd kept every door inside themselves locked shut, stood in front of that wall and put their fingers on a name and broke open. They left things at the base of the wall. Letters. Dog tags. Photographs. A can of beer. A pack of cigarettes, the brand their buddy used to smoke. A pair of boots. That wall did something that the whole country had failed to do for a decade. It said, these men were here. They were real. They mattered. And what that generation carried, what so many of them are still carrying right now, today, this morning, is not just the memory of war. It's the weight of having been through something enormous and having a country that couldn't decide whether to thank them or blame them, honor them or forget them. It's the weight of being told you're a hero and a villain in the same decade by the same people. It's the weight of knowing that the kid who stood next to you in the landing zone didn't come home, and that his name is on a wall in Washington, and that most Americans walked past it on their way to the Lincoln Memorial without stopping. That's what this generation carries. And they carry it quietly, because that's how they were raised, and because nobody ever really asked them to put it down. There's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans has been tragically, disproportionately high for decades. Year after year, veterans have been taking their own lives at rates consistently higher than the general population. A major VA study tracking nearly 10 million Vietnam-era veterans over 41 years documented more than 94,000 suicides in that group alone. 94,000. That is not a statistic. That is a sea of empty chairs at kitchen tables across this country. The war didn't end when the last helicopter left the embassy roof in Saigon. For a lot of men, it never ended at all. And yet, they built lives. That's the part that deserves to be said, too. They came home broken and they rebuilt. They married. They raised kids. They coached Little League. They ran businesses. They taught school. They drove trucks and built houses and fixed engines and served on town councils. They did all of it with a weight on their shoulders that most of the people around them never knew about, because they didn't talk about it, because men of that era didn't talk about it, because there was no one waiting to listen. They weren't looking for pity. They never were. A lot of them will tell you that straight. I don't want anybody feeling sorry for me. What they want, what they've always wanted, is to be remembered honestly. The whole thing. Not just the battles. Not just the politics. Not just the protest signs or the body counts. The whole thing. The fear and the courage and the confusion and the betrayal and the brotherhood and the silence and the long, quiet years that followed. This isn't nostalgia. It's not a history lesson. It's the story of what happens when a country sends its young men to war and then can't figure out how to bring them all the way home. There are men watching this right now who have never told their wives the whole story. There are men watching this who still keep a photograph in a drawer, a buddy from the platoon, young, grinning, alive, and they open that drawer sometimes, when the house is quiet, and they just look at it. There are women watching this who remember what it was like to wait. To check the mail every day. To watch the news every night and hold their breath. And there are women watching this who were there, who served, who saw things in those field hospitals that they've never been able to put into words. If you know someone like that, if he's in the next room, or across town, or if you haven't called him in a while, maybe today's a good day. You don't have to say anything big. You don't have to say, "Thank you for your service." Most of them will tell you those words never quite fit anyway. Just ask him about it. And then do the hardest thing of all. Just listen. If this meant something to you, if it said something you've been carrying, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who was there. Sometimes it helps to know that somebody finally tried to get it right. And if you've got a story of your own, your draft number, your homecoming, the name on the wall that you still think about, I'd like to hear it. Put it in the comments. Because those stories deserve to be somewhere other than the silence.